Um, and then hopefully leaving a lot of time for Q&A and just getting in depth into some of these concepts. So I know I recognize a few of you from Forum 1 or even some of the Planning Commission briefing that we did a few months ago. But how many of you are sort of brand new to this project, sort of starting from scratch in your familiarity? Catherine clapping her hands. Catherine, does that mean you're new or you're deeply familiar? I should have waited 2 more minutes. We have more people popping in here. All right.
And feel free to use the chat as well. I know sometimes it gets a little unwieldy when we have a lot of attendees. So you can either speak up or use the chat function to ask a question or answer, whatever you're comfortable with.
So that was Kim Rybold from the city of Wilsonville. And then you'll see Philip Bradford. They're co-project managers from the city side on this, and they'll be weighing in occasionally. And then Miranda Bateshell, who's planning director for the city, is also on the call. So any global questions about how this fits in to sort of the broader Wilsonville planning scheme, those three will also be able to help advise on. My colleague Colin Roberts is also here, landscape designer. I'll be handing it off to him here shortly to walk you through the fun part, the concepts. So, all right, more names coming in. All right. Okay, a couple new to the process in the chat. So we'll give a little bit of background there. Make sure everyone's settled in.
Started.
Oh, you have to go?
No.
I was just checking in.
Did someone have a question? Or maybe that was just some audio. All right, let's get going here again. All right, I'm gonna get a slideshow pulled up here. So just bear with me for a second. All right, can everyone see that?
Yep.
Great, all right. So again, for those of you who just joined, I'm Ben Weber with Sarah Architects, helping support the Wilsonville Town Center Streetscape plan. We'll give a little bit of project background, but I will make sure to introduce the broader team as we go through the next 30 minutes or so, and then hopefully we can leave the second half of this hour for some more Q&A. So, all right, today what we're going to be up to, a quick project overview. So many of you are familiar with the project and had been with us in November at Forum 1, but for those of you who are new, we'll show you some of that background. If there's anything that I skimmed over too quickly, please chat or raise your hand or feel free to ask me a question as we go. We'll be presenting a little bit, but I welcome your questions and conversation as we go. So I think that's the definition of a forum, is a conversation as opposed to a lecture. So hopefully we keep things casual. All right, so what's this project about? A lot of you are probably familiar with the town center plan that was adopted a few years ago in Wilsonville, looking at sort of a holistic and significant overhaul of the town center from a land use and infrastructure perspective, bringing a broader mix of uses in, thinking about private development and public improvements to streets and open spaces. And the recommendations of that plan for a number of street improvements. So you can see those mapped out here on the left, where both existing streets, such as Town Center Loop in blue, Park Place in purple, and a whole bunch of new proposed streets in those gray lines are intended and proposed to, permeate through the town center to create more of a street grid and to really change sort of the development pattern and just the urban character of the town center. That plan also came up with street cross-section concepts like you're seeing on the right here, a curbless festival street example. And so our work is building upon this foundation of the town center plan and taking it a step further to start thinking about more specifics in the designs, the materials, the landscaping, the furnishings like lights and benches, and to apply that at specific locations throughout the town center. I'll get into that a little bit later, but we'll be looking at up to 11 specific design locations as we work on this plan the next couple months. This is all with the intention of helping transform town center streets from what they look like today into something that kind of matches this vision, where the streets are more active and safe people places, helping to inspire private development, and really blending between the street space, open spaces, and private site development to just create a really welcoming, safe, and as you can see, bike lanes and transit, multimodal space for all users. Where we are on the process, we kicked this off in roughly October and had a community forum back in November, just about project foundations, as well as a planning commission meeting. We're now at the refined concepts stage. So you'll see 3 concepts later on, and we are in forum number 2 right now. Coming out of this, we hope to narrow down to a preferred concept. And then in early March, we'll go to planning commission to discuss the recommendations for that preferred concept. And then probably early April to have a similar conversation with city council. That's to make sure we're, essentially getting off on the right foot with the preferred concept, getting confirmation of that, and then transferring into the actual plan writing and the specific design work on those 11 locations that I mentioned. So you'll be able to keep tabs on this project online through Let's Talk and other City of Wilsonville websites and forums in the coming 3 or 4 months. Just a little bit of that background. Again, we're striving to think about streets as places for, that support vibrant, walkable destinations that inspire people to come together and socialize, shop, live, and work. It's a vision statement from the plan. Someone have a question, or if could you please everyone mute unless you have a question or a statement you want to bring up. All right, thank you very much. Out of that, town center goals across 6 areas. So we just put a few stars here next to some of the ones that are most relevant to our streetscape work. This includes, support for landscaping, the use of a cohesive design palette, coherence with development standards across the public and the private realm, really trying to remove, barriers to walking and promoting walking and biking as really viable and appealing modes in the town center. Promoting safety, of course, thinking about streets as community gathering spaces, and thinking about streets that promote economic prosperity. How does it make it easier and more welcoming to go to businesses, and for businesses to spill out onto the street? I think 2 years ago, the town center plan would have never anticipated COVID, for example, but we're seeing the way that streets have become crucial to outdoor business activity in so many communities. And I think we're all optimistic that kind of creative use of outdoor spaces can continue for years to come. As we go through these designs, please think about these signs of success: the design, the ecology, safety and comfort, versatility, sociability, and the vibrancy and activity of the streets. Kind of take a mental snapshot of this, and we'll come back to this and pose a few questions to you. So again, looking at that streetscape network, we'll kind of blast through that slide real quick. We had mentioned that. And then these are just examples. You can go find the town center plan and dig into this chapter much more deeply if you want to see, it's nearly a dozen sort of concept designs in that plan that we're taking inspiration from and that we'll be taking a step further. So that's some background homework you can do over the coming couple weeks if you like, if we get snowed in. But that's just to show, sort of the versatility or the range of different street concepts that are out there. We have this curbless festival street. We have non-vehicle promenades entirely, where, in this case, a parking lot drive aisle is transformed into this natural promenade with a cycle track and abundant landscaping. And that's just to point out that the different streets throughout the town center will require very different levels of intervention. Some for entirely new construction, some for a design and rebuild, and some, with just a minor refresh. So we'll get into that in the coming months with those 11 locations. We're also tying in with other influential plans like the I-5 bridge design that's underway, the wayfinding and signage plan, and the urban forestry plan that's underway. So looking at that I-5 bridge concept, this is certainly a degree more specific than we're getting. This is going to be a construction ready project, but there's a lot of design aesthetics and design of the plaza spaces that we want to try to be consistent with and ensure that our streets and promenades really tie into. The wayfinding and signage plan, which was recently adopted, looking at wayfinding and navigation in the town center and throughout Wilsonville, as well as just the aesthetics here. You're seeing the use of metal and stone, for example, and we try to reflect that in a lot of the streetscape concepts that we've brought up. And then the urban forestry management plan, this is also underway and going for the next few months. This will be really influential for helping think about the street trees, landscaping, and stormwater facilities that will permeate throughout Wilsonville and specifically in the town center plan. So we'll be building upon some of this technical work to think about how to take those recommendations and build it into an attractive, safe, and easy enough to maintain streetscape environment. We also know the town center has some really nice qualities to build upon today. Functional but improvable streets, such as Courtside here, bike lanes and sidewalks, but thinking about the ways this could be improved as more of a mixed use kind of town center, sort of commercial district and activity center. In your open spaces, you make great use of brick and carved stone to establish your gathering and reflection points. You have a successful transit system running through town and the town center. So we'll be integrating bus shelters, transit stops, and the wayfinding for that. Sometimes a mix and match of things, at least 3 different street lamp types in the town center. So we want to try to bring some unity to the way that we select these kinds of products and just provide, a distinct design aesthetic and consistency for the whole town center. Same thing with furnishings, benches, water fountains, trash cans. We'll be looking at all of those accoutrements that fit into the sidewalk zone. Feedback we've heard so far, again, supports that cohesive, unifying town center design. The work with wood, stone, glass, brick, and even metal. Working with the I-5 bridge design, public art, gathering spaces, and generally a strong support for a modern natural look. So our concepts take sort of 3 different approaches towards that modern natural look. So I'm going to hand it off here to Colin in just a moment for preliminary streetscape designs, but just keep in mind where we are in the process. So I mentioned those 11 locations. We have some good ideas about where those will be, important streets like Courtside and Park Place, as well as some of the new streets, those gray lines that will be dotted in here. But Colin, myself, and the team will be selecting these locations over the coming, 1 to 2 months. And so right now, the concepts aren't a specific location in the town center. They're sort of generic, but they're intended to contain all of the features and qualities that you'd want to see in town center streets, throughout the entire area. As we look at the different streets in the future, some are bigger, some are smaller, some support vehicles, some don't. So we'll have to work through those details. But right now we're trying to think through like what's kind of the theme of the concept. And then later on in the coming months, we'll specify it to those exact locations. Okay, any questions with all that before we get into the concepts? No, okay, hearing none. Colin, hand it off to you and let me know when to move the slides.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so we've come up with 3 concepts. Each one you're going to see have similar materials and similar aesthetics that have been vetted by community members, city council briefly. And it's how we use those materials that's going to differ. And between the concepts, we're trying to tell a different story. Each concept tells a story, but we're trying to tell, we take a theme and apply that to a streetscape. So what does that theme look like? All 3 concepts start with this kind of partie diagram and the first one is agricultural legacy. And so we think about what that generally looks like as a concept, and that's what you see in front of you. And then the next step would be to start thinking about these geometries, applying actual use types and space types to that geometry. So again, thinking high level, but starting to narrow down into that street scale. And these actually, Ben, if you go back one, each of these concepts is going to deal with these 4 major areas that we've identified. So gathering spaces, landmarks, public areas or transit stops, landscape areas, and motive spaces. So you'll see these colors and these areas consistent through each of the concepts. So for agricultural legacy, this is when we start to take that high level partie diagram and zoom into a street. This is, again, a completely made up street. This does not exist. This is showing what this concept could look like at a street scale. This agricultural legacy concept deals with these 3 main ideas of being purposeful, structured, and timeless. It might represent the most, it's the most usual looking street or normal looking street to what you might see as you walk out in Wilsonville today or most cities. Among the 3 concepts, this is the most normal, quote unquote, looking one. But we start to take those general geometries from the high level diagram and start to create actual spaces. So what do transit stops start to look like? What do gathering spaces start to look like? How do plazas start integrating into the streetscape? And yeah, where do stormwater facilities located along the right-of-way? What do those start to look like? And this is what we've come up with for our agricultural legacy concept. And then even more zoomed in, we're starting to look at what these spaces look like in section. And for this concept, we like the idea of, you'll see it later, but some actual planters that might represent the could be agricultural hay bales. It could be those large crates that you collect apples in, you know, starting to apply these typologies to actual streetscape elements. We, in our first forum, talked a lot about gathering spaces, and we're not adverse to inclement weather as Oregonians. So we started talking about covered spaces and how to make streets more useful and useful year round. So, and when we dive into the specific materials and what do these concepts really look like, we start applying photos as examples. These are not what, you know, this isn't what will actually be in there, but these are starting to think about what does this really look like. And again, what do benches look like? Well, maybe they're in this concept, since it's agricultural, it's purposeful, structured, you know, think, yeah, that very organic in purposeful. So steel, wood, you see Core-10 street tree planters there. Yeah, our gathering spaces are very geometric, again, responding to agricultural fields. When you think about like a satellite image looking down on agricultural fields, you start to see these geometries come to life. Again, motive spaces using these filled concrete or colored concrete bands, create these that idea of applying that, again, high level diagram into something specific. And then more specific about materials, we're looking at, again, steel, timber, Core-10 steel grates, and stamped concrete, again, creating a trellis. That was one example of a trellis-like structure. Sandblasted concrete, and again, that cast in place concrete banding applied to these different areas along the streetscape. And then we zoom in even further. This is the highest level. When we look at a specific intersection, we talk about crosswalk treatments and plaza features, ADA paving. When we talk about, you know, I think everyone's used to seeing a bright yellow ADA paver, but what if that was Core-10? And what if your bike racks were, I think this was an ode to like a hitching post. There's a lot of equestrian legacy in Wilsonville and the surrounding area. And again, with the streetlights, instead of a metal pole, what if we brought in a timber pole with a metal fixture?
Interrupt you here, Colin, for a quick question from Todd. Good question, Todd. Can we explain what a motive space is?
Sure. So when we are looking at these streetscapes, we're talking about motive spaces versus gathering spaces or passive spaces. So motive would be any place where people are moving through or around as a primary function of that space.
And that means not just along the sidewalk, but, you know, from the sidewalk to on-street parking, or from the sidewalk into a building entrance or a park or a plaza. So movement in any number of directions.
Or a pedestrian-only street would be an example. You know, there's going to be motive spaces and gathering spaces in there as well. So the second concept we came up with was technological innovation. A lot of big tech area history in this area. And so by, again, starting at that very high level again, what does that form look like? I initially thought of a circuit board and kind of how these modular spaces can be used. How do spaces become adaptable, less prescribed was another theme that we had thought of. And the other design factor would be contrast, high contrast between materials, between spaces. And then again, getting a little more, okay, now we have this high level. Now where do we start applying these spaces? And then again, down to streetscape scale. What do these spaces start to look like, feel like? And in this example, these are geometries that I might know, maybe I know what I want to be a planter or not, but it's the idea that, that could be a planter, that could be a raised planter. These geometries can take on different forms. None of that has been decided. It's simply applying a high level design into a streetscape scale.
Yeah, this is a good chance to quickly point out, we're communicating with Smart Transit, for example, about where bus shelters, should be located today and where they would be in the future, on what exact streets, and how to integrate that into the sidewalk and the street zone. So we're not getting location specific right now, but we're anticipating that. Same thing with stormwater, as we think about how much stormwater capacity do we need in the street, what's the uphill side and the downhill side of the street for drainage. Those will be some of the factors that help us think about where to actually locate these facilities.
Right. Yeah. And, big stormwater facilities might not make sense on some right of ways, whereas, pedestrian only streets, that might provide an opportunity for a large rain garden type situation. So again, looking at those active motive spaces versus gathering spaces, in contrast to to the agricultural theme, the tech theme starts to, again, it's less prescribed spaces, more modular spaces. The covering that I show here in the gathering space starts to look a little more modular, less agricultural, in contrast again. Applying those to street features, again, similar materials, slightly different aesthetic, bringing a little more technological innovation, bringing a little more contrast in paving design, or in pavers or concrete benches. And looking at specific materials, again, you see that same contrast, similar concrete banding, but this time in a different pattern that gets to more of that contrast. And then polished stone, which you'll see is a contrast to our last concept, but again, just different elements that deal with simplicity, modularity, contrast. And intersection design, looking at plaza features, you see a lot of linear pavers, linear banding, linear landscape beds. And well, what if a plaza feature was round in circles in contrast? Crosswalk treatments, we start to talk about adding lighting to those instead of just having pavers. The street lights start to look a little more modern and simple. This time all steel instead of, like maybe a powder coated steel instead of timber. And the ADA paving instead of Core 10, we start to look at something that's a little simpler, maybe a little cleaner lines in a technological concept. Same with the bike racks, very simple. And our last concept is our river environment. Obviously, living in Wilsonville, we're surrounded by nature, surrounded by river, water systems. High level thinking here, thinking about flow and movement through space. That's where these arrows and colors come from, these high level diagrams. And applying that to a street scale. In this example and the previous concept technology, you start to see a pedestrian only street there in the middle, bottom, in the middle. What does that start to look like and how does that integrate into the streetscape? Again, applying these forms from that high level diagram onto a street, talking about how transit stops and stormwater would look like. It's a lot different. Again, these are just forms and shapes at this point, but eventually when these streets get designed, these forms will take on, maybe it's a planter, maybe it's a raised planter. And again, strategically located, right? So in a parking area, if we have, if there is on-street parking, wouldn't want a raised planter right next to street parking, right? So this is just starting that idea, zooming into that, not quite to construction yet, but applying these high-level concepts. And again, motive versus gathering spaces. Now your gathering space, maybe it's a little more, your covered area is a little more organic in form. The beds are a little more organic in form. You start to see a more nature, less hardscape, maybe a little more softscape, keeping with that river environment theme. And not only are there undulations in the movement patterns, but also maybe we're talking about movement in raised beds, right? Maybe there's mounding, maybe there's wave forms, undulations in the raised planters. That's what you see on that motive space section there on the bottom one. And applying those to street elements, definitely more organic forms, less hard lines, more green, integrating lighting into public land or public art, more green spaces, highlighting green spaces. Gathering spaces are kind of these, that image kind of shows this idea of a real river, right? Like we have eddies and flows in a river. So maybe these gathering spaces act as these kind of eddies for this movement through space. And again, that bottom, the motive space, talking about how you're not moving in a linear form, you're kind of flowing, ebbing and flowing. And we start to talk about specific materials for the river environment, still keeping with the wood, still keeping with timber and stone, but this time maybe it's a natural stone, not a polished stone. And the tree grates have this, ring pattern like a water droplet, right? Instead of geometric lines. In the concrete banding, instead of having linear concrete banding or large block-like concrete banding, maybe these are, again, more organic in form, wave-like, water-like. And applying those to intersections and intersection elements, bike racks, again, more organic in form. We see that Core 10 come back with the ADA paving, and the streetlights, more organic form, less vertical, modern. Now we're talking more about organic fluidity, natural. Same with the crosswalk treatment. Instead of having just a regular zebra stripe, maybe it's a concrete banding that's more wave-like. And these are all three of our concepts for comparison. If you want, we're not going to go through it, but you can dive into the specific designs on top there. But really, if you just look at those high-level designs, you can really see very clearly kind of the main difference in thinking between the three.
We'll come back to this slide for Q&A and discussion. It's a good singular image to have on screen while we talk through options. So don't worry, we'll come back to this here momentarily. So those are the three concepts. We'll ask you a few specific questions here in the chat and in the polling shortly. We just also wanted to raise some of the kind of universal themes that we're thinking about across all three of these. And when we get to a recommendation in the coming month, we don't assume it's going to be exactly agriculture, exactly technology, or exactly river. There'll be a blend of features, and that's what we want to ask you about here today. And so some of these themes, like a promenade street that can be used for vehicle traffic when needed, but closed for festivities and providing stormwater and landscaping and really unique business access. That's a theme we're keeping in mind. Here's other examples of those pedestrian-only uses, which is a factor in the town center plan. Stormwater, as we mentioned, will be a big technical thing that we integrate, ensuring that we're working with the Public Works Department to locate stormwater facilities and meet city standards, but also to provide a nice, design aesthetic and landscape planting area that really improves kind of the experience and natural environments of the streetscape. That urban forestry management plan will also factor into the stormwater conversations. And again, stormwater can happen both in the sidewalk zone as curb extensions and near parking, but also near the back of the sidewalk in those plazas and building edges. So there's a lot of opportunity to use it as a way of defining spaces and kind of working through those 4 different color zones that Colin mentioned. Again, integrating transit in the streetscapes, creating those bus pull-out environments and waiting areas, shelters when needed, and also anticipating, future transit services. It might be smaller vehicles, it might be self-driving buses in a decade or two. So we're trying to think about how to create the streetscape that's sort of future ready. As I mentioned, in those 11 locations, some of those will be strictly within the street right-of-way, but we're also going to look at a few locations where the public and the private realm sort of blend together, where there's a forecourt plaza. You have a couple examples of this in Wilsonville already that are really successful, where when done properly, you might not even know when you're sort of in the public street versus on the private property, because it's a welcoming sort of gathering environment, business or housing environment that blends between spaces. Other examples of those, and I should mention, we'll make sure that this slideshow gets posted on the city website here shortly, so you can revisit these examples. So we're actually going to start a few questions here at this point.
And Ben, before we do, I do see that we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Maybe before we move on, we can answer those. And I can take one of them if you want to take the first one.
Okay. Yeah, Courtney asks, how do these crosswalk treatments comply with federal traffic control, MUTCD, which is the manual and uniform traffic control device requirements? Yeah, we're definitely working with Public Works to ensure MUTCD compliance and Americans with Disabilities Act compliance. So there are standards that we're ensuring to work with. And then there's also, an exemption or an exception process where if we want to put forth a crosswalk or a curb extension that's, sort of a unique design, if we can prove that it's still MUTCD compliant for traffic control and safety and disability access, we can consider that as well. So that's a question we haven't, made an absolute decision about. Do we want to sort of comply with basic standards or seek a unique solution, but that would still meet all those requirements?
And I can take the second question about parking and parking availability. There is some discussion in the town center plan about parking. Obviously, one of the things we looked at when we did the planning process was that we have a lot of parking currently. But as change occurs in the town center, there are some recommendations in terms of how parking might be oriented to development. In the longer term, there is a recommendation to do a parking management plan. So we do kind of have some guidance to think about how we look at where parking is located and how it's managed in the future. That being said, I think the parking typically would be handled on the private side of development. And so that wouldn't necessarily, we could look at ways in how the streetscape plan can influence parking areas, particularly if they are surface parking or on-street parking where that is recommended. And so that is something that the city will be continuing to monitor as development and change occurs in town center.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Cam, and thank you for those good questions, Courtney. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm going to put one back to you in a pop-up poll that hopefully works. I don't see any hands raised, so let me get this going here. As I mentioned, these sort of 6 key themes for goals: design, ecology, safety, comfort, versatility, sociability, vibrant and active, are really kind of the guiding principles and goals we're striving for in these streetscapes. We're going to ask you a question here and want your vote. This is non-binding, but want to get kind of your straw poll opinion as to which of these three concepts, best fulfills these goals. So I think I have to stop screen sharing to launch this. Fingers crossed this works. I'll let Spence back into the room here. Okay, and launch polling. And I hope everyone is seeing that. And then as soon as voting is closed, we'll welcome your spoken or written thoughts. Give us about 10 more seconds. All right. 10 of 14 votes. Are there any more out there? Going once, going twice. Let me take a photo of this and then, all right, I'm gonna end polling here. So just so everyone knows, there were 5 votes for river, 4 for technological, and 1 for agriculture in this. So thank you for your input. So a few more questions I'll put back to you, but want to ask if anyone has comments that you want to offer up sort of in support of this question. And I can go back to the screen sharing if that's helpful. Just a second here.
So Ben, while you're doing that, I have a general question regarding the 3 design options.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, are there any significant differences in terms of long-term maintenance? Because we tend to just be very happily selecting new designs or whatever, and don't think much about what the long-term cost might be associated with the design we pick.
Yeah, that's a great question. I wouldn't say at this stage that one of these concepts is more maintenance heavy than the other, but we know that over the next couple months, sort of whichever concept we move forward with, we're very much going to be thinking about maintenance, cost to construct at the very beginning, and a lot of those other factors. You want to build this streetscape once and make it work for decades, and think about the costs throughout the entire kind of lifespan of the street. So yeah, we will be having some deep conversations about, hey, is this landscape too labor intensive or too costly to maintain? Are these materials fragile? Are they hard to power wash, for example? We've heard from city power, public works and engineering, just about that kind of simple consideration. Heck, we might even get snow this week. So how does a snow plow, make it through the street without breaking fragile features? So those are all going to be things that we kind of build into this. All right. Any other, question came up in chat here. To that end, how will residents be impacted financially to implement this plan? Is a capital bond required? I can speculate on that, but I might leave it for city staff.
Sure, I could take that one. And so a lot of it is going to depend on who is constructing the improvements. If it's a frontage improvement associated with private development, typically the cost to construct the facility is a cost that is undertaken by the developer. So things like a frontage improvement, a sidewalk, street trees, those are typically things that private development pays for. As it relates to some of the infrastructure projects that are currently in the town center plan, like if we're looking at a whole section of a street, that is something that we will be looking towards as we develop a finance plan for the town center itself. That is one of the town center plan's implementation projects. And so within the next year or so, we're going to start that project up and start looking at costs of some of these. We have some preliminary cost numbers in terms of the improvements that are planned, but looking at what financing mechanisms the city would use, knowing that there is a component of private development that pays for some of the improvements, but there is a public component and share to some of those as well.
Yeah. All right, great question. Okay. I want to put another one back to you. So feel free to speak out or type in the chat window. Which elements, gathering space, movement areas, landscape, plazas, or public art of a streetscape are most important to your enjoyment of a streetscape? And do you see those qualities in these concepts? Give everyone a minute to type in responses if you have them, or feel free to raise your hand and speak up.
It looks like we do have another question here from Courtney about feedback from local businesses. So I guess that's a couple piece approach to that. The list, actually, a lot of our subscribers to the list for the town center projects are local businesses that have previously been involved in the development of the town center plan itself. And so we are looking as we, both in the feedback we got through the town center plan process, there was a local business input in that. And as well as we continue these projects going forward, we are seeking to have stakeholder discussions, and we have, thought about, who the best contacts are for that. So we still have a couple of stakeholder discussions that we're looking to have. So if there are any suggestions for that, we would gladly take those. And then as well, going forward, a lot of the town center plan's implementation priorities really get at engaging the local business community and thinking about how some of the activities or things, implementation activities can really be supported by the local businesses in the community as opposed to being city-led. And so there are a lot of planned future implementation activities that we're hoping to get some coalition building, and we'll be working to do that as we continue implementation of the town center plan.
Yeah, definitely. I've got one chat here on priorities for lighting, safety, parklets, and open space. So that's good to know. By lighting, Courtney, I think you wrote this. Do you mean more like lighting for safety and traffic and street crossing purposes? Lighting for the open spaces or the gathering areas? What's important about that for you?
I would say a couple things. One, with the crossings particular, there's a few spaces in town that it is very challenging to see people. And if we're going to prioritize more pedestrian and cyclist traffic, we also need to ensure that we're protecting their safety by helping them to be as visible as possible. So that's a main thing, but also lighting just in general makes those spaces more inviting and makes them more usable, particularly in the summer, hot months, things like that. Wanting to say be out of your house and being able to spend time outside and still not feel like you're out in the dark. Sometimes that's nice.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you for that. Let's see. Catalina, you've put a couple comments in here in support of the river concept and the movement and landscape zones for that. And Steve emphasizing the movement areas, ultimately most important. I think that's fair, getting around and recognizing the culture and heritage of the town center and Wilsonville, even the broader Willamette Valley region overall, trying to factor that in. So those are good things for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree with the emphasis on the movement areas. It's nice for them to be aesthetic, but they also should allow you to get to where you're going without detours. So I'm a little worried about meandering river paths. Movement areas. But in general, the whole thing, and this is what came out in the task force, town center task force, is we want it to be aesthetic, but also practical.
All right. All right, with only a few minutes to go here, I'm going to pose a few more questions to you all, but we can kind of consider this a freewheeling moment of the forum. Go one more down here. First, if everyone in the chat could just type out your rankings of these from favorite to least favorite. We just want to get a straw poll on that, or feel free to say it out loud. So that's one assignment. And then, of course, as we're coming to a close here, I just want to gather any final input, anything we haven't asked you about, or specific things you like or dislike about any of these concepts. And if you have strong positive or negative opinions about any of them. And feel free to speak those out loud or put those in the chat too.
Okay, being lazy on typing, I go for technology, then river, and then agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's written in my notebook here, so part of the official record. All right, Susan, Catalina, you've put in some rankings. So as we close, is there anything else you all want to bring up or that you think we on this design team should know or really take into better consideration?
I saw the chat comment that we really need to pay attention to the current business owners that are in town center. So I would want to make sure that they have a voice in any of the decisions, especially if they'll be the ones who have to pick up quite a bit of the cost.
Definitely.
And one thing I'll note too is that there are, within the broader town center plan, there are implementation priorities about business retention assistance. And so, that is something that as we move forward in the future, that is a priority for the city to work with, economic development and thinking about how businesses can be supported. Obviously, change isn't going to happen until somebody wants to come in and do something different with their property. And so, existing businesses would not necessarily be on the hook to pay for an improvement like this. It really would be any long-term new development and investment in the area.
Yeah, seeing a few comments about long-term maintenance and not wanting to burden businesses, particularly small local businesses that have had a tough year of it already. with undue burden in bringing the streetscape about. So we will ensure to keep talking with, property and business owners in the community. There's also a comment in here about additional multifamily housing. And yeah, that's definitely part of the town center plan. You could dig into that document to see more of sort of about the land use planning and the vision to bring more residential into the town center. All right, well, we are coming to a close here. I know Colin and I expect probably Kim and Philip can stay on a little bit of overtime if anyone has other topics you want to raise up. I know an hour goes fast. You can also find this project on Let's Talk Wilsonville, where there's an email contact that will go straight to Philip. If you have further thoughts, we'll make sure to get this recording and the slideshow online so you can check it out at your leisure.
And I would note as well that there will be a short survey asking similar types of questions that will be available later this week on Let's Talk. And so, if you have any other thoughts or, know somebody that wasn't able to attend one of these forums, but you think want to provide feedback, I would encourage you to check in there. I believe by Thursday we'll have that up, and that'll be open for a couple of weeks.
Great. All right, well, thank you everyone for your official time this past hour. We'll stick around and of course, tell your friends to come back at 6 p.m. tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye, thank you. All right. Catherine or Anne, is there anything you want to keep talking about? All right, well, we'll let Catherine and Anne come back if they do. So. All right. Well, Philip and Kim, I think this is a good reminder of our continued mandate to reach out to a couple more business owners. I know we've had a little bit of a challenge pinning some folks down the past couple of weeks, but I think that's going to be important, particularly between now and Planning Commission, to have those conversations and really gauge support and concerns there.
And I would suggest maybe since we've been a little stuck on getting a couple of these other stakeholder groups, that, knowing that we've heard this question, I think it's maybe at this point suitable to pivot and see, if Philip can maybe organize, based on, I think we threw out the idea a while back about some of the town center participants from the task force that were in the business community as being a starting point, to see if maybe that's a small group that can be assembled.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, definitely. Follow up on that this week. All right. Catherine and Anne, if I don't hear from you in a moment, I might put you back in the waiting room if you don't mind. All right. Okay. All right. Stop recording here.